This is the Erica Synths Graphic Resonant Filterbank, and these are some of the sounds I've been making with it. So what exactly is the Graphic Resonant Filterbank? Well, it's a modern take on a cult classic of modular synthesis, the Serge Resonant EQ. The original design dates back to the late 70s and it's pretty simple, a bank of 10 manually controlled filter bands which are tuned to produce formant peaks and valleys similar to those found in acoustic instruments. The bands are resonant, and when feedback is introduced things can get pretty wild. As well as processing sound sources in subtle or extreme ways, it can self-oscillate for complex drones, or you can ping it with pulses to create organic sounding percussion. For the Graphic Resonant Filterbank, Erica Synths took the same basic idea but added a bunch of digital control to the analog circuit, bringing it right up to date and massively expanding the range of potential applications. As well as the all-important CV control over the levels of each band, including some clever shift register and sample and hold functionality, there are modes that simulate traditional multimode filters, and you can store snapshots of the settings which you can then step through with a clock or address via CV. This video is sponsored by Erica Synths, and in it I'm going to build some patches that explore what the Graphic Resonant Filterbank can do, from complex spectral animation to pinging and feedback. If you want to see more about the nitty-gritty of the various modes, I also highly recommend DivKid's video, which is a bit of a masterclass as usual. I'll link to that below. And by the way, don't be fooled by the screen and the buttons on the Resonant FB. It might look digital, but the signal path is completely analog. The resonance screams and it can get just as filthy as the Serge. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so when you boot up the Resonant Filterbank, you're presented with this home screen which lets you enter the various operating modes and configure various settings. There are essentially 5 modes which let you process incoming audio. There's the FB mode, which is the kind of standard 10-band filter bank. You can manually control those bands using the expander here, or you can, without the expander, you can select them one at a time and adjust the gain and cut manually with the encoder. You can also CV control them, and you've got the resonance control. That's the kind of standard mode which you'll probably find yourself using the most if you're anything like me. There are 4 other modes though, which I'll come onto in a bit more detail in separate patches. There's the Multimode filter emulation mode, filter here, which basically will sequentially cut and boost these bands to mimic the effects of a low pass, high pass, band pass or notch filter. You can adjust the cutoff frequency and the slope. There is a clocked modulation mode here, which basically will monitor the CV at the inputs, and it will either sample and hold them on the clock across all 10 bands, or you can just input one CV signal, and then as the clock advances, it will shift register style pass that CV value along the 10 bands to get a constantly changing spectrum as it's clocked. That's pretty cool, as we'll see in one of the future patches. There's a dynamic equalizer mode, which cuts and boosts those 10 bands according to the signal's level above or below a threshold that you can set. There is a play mode, which lets you sequentially or via CV address stored presets of sets of settings on the filter bank. You can either clock that sequentially or randomly, or you can address them via CV, as we'll see in one of the future patches as well. The load option just lets you load a snapshot or load a preset, which you previously saved. The spectrum analyzer mode is just a simple visualizer, spectrum analyzer for the input. It doesn't process it in any way, it just gives you a visualization of the signal. And then the config menu lets you adjust various settings. You can see here the firmware version that you're on, change the button layout. You can change display settings like brightness and screensaver. You can configure the CV input, so the voltage range. You can attenuate them globally. And you can choose whether the expander here behaves as an offset, so its positions are added to the CV inputs here, or it can attenuate the incoming CV. You can adjust the resonance curve or the profile of the resonance pot, and you can select which of the bands are processed for feedback via the resonance circuit as well individually. They're all on by default. But yeah, to get us started, let's just go into the standard FB mode, your main kind of filter bank mode. And I've got a saw wave here from Lorelei coming into the input. I'm taking the main output through the stereo strip, just the mono output here, which sounds like this. And if I manually adjust some bands with the expander, you can hear the effect it has on the spectrum as It's also worth saying if you cut everything, we get pretty much silence. And then as we bring things back up, so that all sounds quite cool, but let's try putting some of this stuff under CV control and then playing with the resonance a bit as well. So I'm just going to zero all these, and I'm going to take a source that gives me a lot of CV output. So I've got the filter 8 from Analog down here, which is a filter that can self-oscillate and give you 8 phase shifted outputs of the same sine wave. So I'm in low LFO mode, and I can take these 8 LFOs, and I'm going to go into bands 3 to 10. I'm going to ignore the bottom 2 bands. I'm going to randomly pick these, or semi-randomly pick them. I'm just going to go in from these bands, these LFOs in turn, into these 8 inputs. Now we're getting this kind of constantly morphing spectrum as these bands are cutting and boosting at the same speed but at different phases. So there's 8. And let's bring up a bit of resonance. Important to note actually that the resonance is at 0 at 12 o'clock on here. It's an inverted resonance kind of effect if you bring it down from 12, which kind of attenuates the signal. As you boost it up from 12, we start to get these screeching feedback kind of profiles, which are quite reminiscent of the original Serge. Really nice kind of fizzy, overdriven kind of sound. Let's just bring it back to near enough 12 o'clock. And the other thing we have on the outputs, we have an odd and an even output, which basically give you the odd numbered bands and even numbered bands separately. And this can be really cool for stereo effects. And in fact, let's try running the odd and even outputs through Natural Gate here. So I'm going to go from the odd and even outputs into the inputs of Natural Gate. And I'm going to take the outputs here. I've got a pitch sequence from Octone here, and I'm going to take the trigger output from the sequencer. Let's just tidy this cable up slightly. And now if I get the sequencer going, highly recommend listening to this in stereo, especially on headphones or nice speakers, and you'll hear the spectrum shifting from ear to ear. Just going to add a little bit of modulation of the decay time using a couple of unipolar LFOs from the Oct expander up here as well, just to vary the decay time slightly as we go. And I can manually open these as well. But that simple saw wave is now this really rich, constantly evolving, spectrally shifting, rich stereo kind of tone. Let's bring in a couple of drums. These are are just sequenced off screen from the Shackmat battering ram and Archer's rig. Pams is just sending some very simple patterns there. Okay, next let's look at using noise as the input and animating the spectrum and using an envelope to generate some percussive kind of sounds. So I've got a noise source connected to the input. I've actually got the noise output from the tip-top SD909 module that's off screen. It's just quite a nice white noise source that I like. I've cut the bottom 4 bands completely, and it sounds like this with just the kind of higher frequency bands relatively flat. To modulate them, I'm going to use Erfurt from Chaos Devices, which is basically I'm going to use it as a kind of clock divider, but I'm going to use Lipsk to make some more interesting rhythmic gate patterns from it. So if I get the clock going, you see the bands are being boosted with these gates at progressively slower paces. And if I play with Lipsk a bit, I can change the counting increment on Erfurt, which will give us much more complicated gate patterns. And if we get an envelope, which I'm going to just connect straight into the VCA section of Stereo Strip, we now have this kind of white noise, hi-hatty kind of sound. With a kind of rhythmically changing spectrum. I'm just going to add a little bit of LFO modulation to the panning, just to kind of sweep it from speaker to speaker slightly, and I'm going to attenuate another slow LFO from oct to the resonance. So it's a really nice way of getting spectrally animated percussive sounds. And here's a quick alternative way of doing something similar to that previous patch. I've got the same white noise input, the same VCA controlled by an envelope on the output. But for the modulation of the bands, I'm in clock mode, and I'm sending in a relatively fast LFO into CV input 1, and together with a clock from PAMS on the clock input, we get this effect where on every clock at the input it will sample the value of that LFO, and it will take it in turns to assign that value to the 10 bands. So the kind of spectrum is being shifted one band at a time, and they're following roughly the shape of this LFO. So with only one CV input we can get this constantly shifting harmonic spectrum again, which is great for these kind of percussive sounds, again with a bit of resonance. One feature I really like in the Filterbank mode is the option to randomly generate values for the 10 bands for the cut and boost. If you press Shift, you get this options for randomizing a selection of bands. So if you select a few, you can then randomize the values for them every time you press this button. Or you can randomize all, and that'll just generate a cut or boost value for all 10 bands, which is a really good way of quickly generating sort of spectral snapshots. You can save these as presets, and I'm going to show you in the clock menu how you can then clock through them at regular intervals. So I'm just going to clear all. I'm going to run in a breakbeat from the audio player in the disting here, and we'll just generate a few random patterns with all 10 bands. And to save a preset, you just press and hold the encoder. You can either enter a name manually, or you can hit random to generate a name, which I'll do for the purposes of speed in this demo. Hit save, randomize again. I'm going to try and get 4 or so, which sound quite different. Randomize, save, randomize again. That's quite cool. Random name, save, and let's try one more. Just going to keep going until I find let's try that one. Now, if I go into the play menu, these are the 4 presets I've just stored. And if I hit button 10 that's flashing here, I've got a clock coming in here once a bar from Pam's just off screen. And you can see it cycling through these 4 presets. You can also, if you press Shift, you can randomly clock through them. So if I go into this mode, rather than going through an order, every time it gets a clock it'll pick a new preset at random. You can also pick these via CV, which I'll show you in one of the future patches. So let's go back to Lorelei, and I'm going to use the endless processor from Blue Catch here to turn a kind of arpeggio into a chord, a solid sustained chord, which I'm then going to mangle a bit with the Resonant Filterbank. Here is an arpeggio being driven from octone, and it's running through the endless processor. If I just hit the sustain button and then fade out the original, we have this permanent kind of endlessly droning saw wave chord. Let's cut some of the lower bands, and I've got a bunch of envelopes here being driven by the same clock running through the rung division's clock divider side. So I've got 6 different clock divisions coming into Fuji envelope generator, so I'm going to get 6 different AD envelopes. In fact, let's cut everything. And let's use the upper bands here with some of these envelopes. I'm not too worried about what order these go in. They get progressively slower or less frequent as I go down. I'm just using a divide by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 to trigger these. So that sustained chord is now this quite nice. And by boosting these bands slightly we can get those envelopes to start boosting some of those levels a bit with a bit of resonance. Got a really nice tone here. Let's get it even more dynamic and interesting in stereo. Let's go from the odd and even. So now we'll get something different in each side. Again, listen in stereo or headphones here for best results. And I'm going to take a square wave output from the same oscillator, go down an octave. I'm running that through natural gate. So if I bring that original sequence or that original arpeggio back in, we'll just add some drums to this. I really like this kind of spectrally animated chord, which is really rich in stereo. Shorten these envelopes a bit too. With nothing connected to the input, the Resonant Filterbank will self-oscillate quite nicely, and you can adjust the bands and create a really wide range of tones. For this patch I'm going to take the odd and even outputs and I'm going to run them into the natural gate, and I'm going to ping each side of the natural gate with a slightly different complex rhythm derived from the rung division's clock divider buses. If I get these gates going, and if I turn up the resonance to max, start to hear a tone, and if I start to play with the bands, a huge variety of sounds available. So I've got the odd and even pan slightly left and right. Got little bit of slow unipolar LFO modulation on the decay time. If I open these right up, you can hear the kind of spectrum we're shaping with these knobs, and they all interact with each other. So cutting one or boosting one low down will have an effect on everything higher up. They sound really nice through a low pass gate like this, I think. You can sort of tune in. So these really interesting metallic sort of. Add a kick drum under this rhythm. Just going to sidechain it a little bit in post as well. And just by playing with these bands, you can find all sorts of sweet spots. Quite tonal sounds like this, those kind of rubbery, square wavy sounds, to these more extreme. So let's take the idea from that previous patch on a bit. I'm going to go into clock mode with source set to all, and this will sample and hold the CV values at the inputs whenever it gets a clock at the clock input. So I've got nothing at the audio input again. I'm going to self-oscillate, and I'm just going to feed 4 identical but phase-shifted triangular LFOs into CV inputs 2, 4, 6, and 8. I've got some drum set up from PAMS as well in a little case off screen for a kind of more of a sort of 909 techno patch. And let's just get it going. Attenuated with the gain there as well, these CV inputs slightly. And I've got the resonance just past the edge of self-oscillation, so we're getting this quite atonal, skronky kind of sound, which I think is pretty cool. And if I just up the resonance slightly, there's all these minute little sweet spots in the resonance. The output's running through natural gate, and I'm basically hitting natural gate with the same clock that's hitting the clock on the resonant FB. Just if I up the resonance a little bit more. So just by playing with this resonance, we can get these like this kind of combo of high-pitched, skronky noises and deep bass. Just going to open that decay on the LPG. Just remember, there's nothing at the input here. This is all the unit self-oscillating. All these noises are just caused by the interaction of these resonating bands. Let's have a little look at the filter mode, or the multimode filter emulator. So if you go into here, we're first confronted with a kind of low-pass filter type shape, and you can see as I move the cutoff frequency up and down using the encoder, it cuts and boosts the various bands appropriately to kind of emulate the effect of that filter, but it's actually these 10 bands being individually cut and boosted. Let's get a little sequence. I've got a square wave from Lorelei, and that's coming in, and with this boosting it means we get a nicely overloaded sort of sound. Resonance is at 0 at 12 o'clock, and we can take an envelope, which I'm going to attenuate in Samara, and control the envelope the cutoff in a traditional way. The resonance doesn't really sound like any kind of low-pass filter resonance though. If I kind of up this a bit, you just get into this kind of crazy band resonating vibe. So I'm going to leave that at 12. there are 4 different modes. This is low pass. We've also got high pass. And let's try an LFO. I kind of think these filter emulations almost sound better with smooth, slower modulation like this. And you can see the effect it's having on those 10 bands. We can also control the slope manually by switching to the slope control. We have a very sharp slope or a very wide one. And we can CV control that too. Let's take another LFO. These LFOs coming from Oct, so they're unsynced. So now not only the cutoff but the slope itself are being modulated. And let's go into bandpass. I'm just going to move the center point of that cutoff up a little bit. And the third thing we can modulate is the width of this band. So if we're going to CV5, again I'm just taking another LFO from Oct, attenuating it slightly. So now the band, the slope, and the center point are all being modulated. And for me this sounds best in band stop mode or notch mode, where we get this little pocket of frequencies being cut which is sliding around. And I've done this a few times but I'm going to do it again. Let's go into the odd and even. And if you're listening in stereo, we're now going to get this beautiful stereo effect. Resonance is quite unpredictable, but it really gives us really interesting, raw, spectrally rich sound. One thing I was really keen to do with the Resonant Filterbank was to ping it with a short transient and see what kind of percussive effects we can get when it's nearly self-oscillating. And that's one thing I used to really like doing with the Serge Resonant EQ, and it's really good for kind of woody, percussive sort of timbres. So I've been experimenting a little bit with different kinds of triggers and different kinds of transients to feed into the audio input. The shape I've settled on is a kind of exponential envelope from PAMS, a very short one. And if I've got the resonance just below self-oscillation, you can hear this kind of clicking sound coming in. If I start to bring up a couple of these bands, it overloads quite easily, just like the Serge, but you have got this quite wide range of woody sort of timbres available. The bands are all very interactive. And by playing with the... you just need to back it off when it starts growling. And if you have too many bands up, it starts to get a bit crazy. But it's really interesting as they interact and you get these kind of high pitch tones and these more kind of woodblocky sounds in the upper mid-range. And you can get these kind of tuned drum sort of sounds. So I thought it might be quite fun to use the presets and the CV addressable mode in the play mode to see if I can play these as a kind of drum kit by saving different presets. So let me just stop this a second. I've saved a bunch of these different settings as a load of presets. So these are all in here. I've just got 6 of them for the time being. And if we go into the play mode and select CV addressing, turned off the morphing, and I'm going to play them using this key step 37 from Arturia here. I'm going to take the CV output, I'm going to invert it in Samara and go into CV input 1. For some reason in this firmware it needs negative CV to trigger or to select these sounds, but I've got it working fine by inverting it. I'm going to take the gate output of the key step and that's going to go into the CV input of PAMS onto another channel and basically just let me trigger that as an envelope. So now if I go into this play mode, these are the various presets that I've saved, which I can now trigger from the keyboard. the key sends out a CV value, which is sent to the CV input, which basically selects which of the presets to play. And the gate from the keyboard triggers an envelope in PAMs, which goes into the audio input to ping it. Because it saves the resonance as well as all the band settings for each one. That means we can get a little sequence going. Where I'm just pinging this in and selecting these different configurations of the bands to produce this sort of tuned percussion, and with a bit of reverb added in post. It's a really unique percussion machine. I'm going to take just a quick look at the spectrum analyzer and dynamic equalizer modes on the Resonant FB. These are probably not the main selling points of the unit, to be honest, but they're quite handy to have. Let's feed in some 808 drums. So it's just coming into the audio input. If we go to spectrum analyzer, we get a nice view of the audio spectrum there. Got a couple of options with the shift button. We can turn the peak bars on or off. That's with them off. That's with them on. And they basically fall down from the high points of each of those bars. Gives you a slightly easier look at the overall spectrum over time. And the other option is the scale from linear to logarithmic. With log there, it's spread out a bit further to the right there with the high frequencies bunched up at the right. Let's keep it linear. Let's go back out, go into dynamic equalizer mode. Now the way this works is you bring this threshold down with the encoder. I've got it on at the moment. Frequencies that cross that threshold will be attenuated, so it'll start to cut the bands where there's activity above that line, which gives you a kind of multi-brand compressor, which kind of evens out the spectrum. It's quite subtle. Just A/B it by turning it off. That's off. And that's on. But what's a lot less subtle is the boost option. So if you shift and hit the encoder, and what this does is any bands below that threshold will get a boost, which again evens out the spectrum, but in a slightly more aggressive way. If you bring this down, the effect will be slightly more subtle. As you bring the threshold up, more and more of that spectrum is beneath it, so it's getting more and more boost. And again, if I turn that off, that's the dry signal. And that's the boosted dynamic EQ signal. So yeah, probably not something you would use on a full mix because it's only got a mono input, but if you're working with submix drums or other kind of parts which might benefit from this, it's quite a handy feature to have. So to finish us off, here's a really simple patch that's just using a droning rich chord from Platts. I'm modulating the timbre on Platts with a slow LFO from Aux, which is just kind of adjusting the inversion of that chord. A fairly buzzy, saw-ish kind of wave from the table. Nothing's really happening here, but what I've done is saved a bunch of presets of the filter bank. I'm going to use the play mode again to step through them. I've got 7 of them here, which are all slightly different. And I'm going to use the morphing, which will kind of crossfade the settings from one to the next. I've set a timer 500 milliseconds or half a second. I've got a slow clock coming in. So if I activate this, you'll see this little morph bar. When it changes, just softly transitions from one flavour to the next. Smoothly evolving spectrum combined with the modulation of Platts itself. Possibilities for kind of slowly modulated drones are pretty strong here. And I love how it sounds with these more organ style wavetables from Platts. That feels like a good place to end, and this was a long one, so well done if you've made it this far. If you've enjoyed the video, then leave a like or a comment, and please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again to Erica Synths for sponsoring the video, and thanks to you for watching. I'll be back soon, so see you next time.